Hi, welcome to another episode of Ask an Archaeologist. I'm Sarah Kanza, the host of today's show. Ask an Archaeologist is a series of live streamed interviews co-hosted by the Archaeological Research Facility and the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology at UC Berkeley. During each program, we interview a UC Berkeley archaeologist and answer questions from the audience. You can submit your questions in the live chat box on YouTube. So today we are delighted to have with us Anna Nielsen, who is going to talk about a closer look at Nabataean burials. Anna is a PhD student studying landscapes and Japanese archaeology at UC Berkeley. As an undergraduate, she was fortunate enough to participate in archaeological fieldwork at the famous site of Petra in Jordan, examining both rock-cut tombs and ancient water systems. She's told us that she feels incredibly lucky to be able to study and talk about what she considers to be one of the coolest subjects in the world. And as a bone person, I also agree with you that this is one of the coolest subjects in the world. So thank you, Anna, for joining us.
Thank you for having me today.
Great. And yeah, if you just want to launch into your slides.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, as Sarah said, I've been here at UC Berkeley for 2 years now. I'm a PhD student and I focus on Japan, as you can see from the map behind me. So it seems a little bit strange that I would be talking about Jordan today, but I had a great deal of fun there. It was absolutely fantastic to be able to work on the projects that I was working on. And also I feel that there's a lot of surprising parallels between the work that I do now in Japan and the work that we did in Jordan, and also parallels of archaeology throughout the world. So I'm going to start sharing my slides. Sarah, do let me know if there's any sort of technical difficulties, if you can't hear me or if you can't see.
Everything looks great.
Okay, is that full screen now?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, so yes, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the burial types we've seen. Just a quick disclosure, there are going to be a few pictures of bones in this slide. If that's a problem for you, I feel like I should say so right up ahead. So just to very quickly introduce, some of you may have heard of the site of Petra before in Jordan. I believe some people like Sarah have been there before. But it's not as well known as I feel it should be. So the Petra was the capital of the Nabataean kingdom, which flourished from about 400 BC to 300, 400 AD. It was annexed by the Romans in 106 AD and experienced a very large cultural change. As you can see, Petra is there in the center of all of those trade routes. And then the shaded area is kind of the extent of Nabataean power. And the Nabataeans were very wealthy because of their role that they played in the incense trade, the unguents trade of this incense that was moved from the south coast of the Arabian Peninsula up through the Mediterranean world. Here's a piriform unguentarium, which is the kind of vessel that they used, and then they would often set these vessels inside of lamps so that the incense would be heated and would make your house or your temple smell very nice. And they were in great demand. So the Nabataeans were very wealthy, and they used their wealth to build fantastic temples and tombs, the remains of which are still seen. Something I want to emphasize, because what I want to talk about is how the landscape studies that we did can relate to the rest of the world. I wanted to show you really quick an idea of the landscape of Petra. Here's a picture from the roof of the house where we were staying in Sehun, which is a Bedouin village inhabited by the Bedouin tribe. And it looks just like a very plain, empty desert. But actually, if you look at the mountains on both sides, those cliff faces are absolutely filled with massive monumental carved tombs. You can see some of them more clearly on the left side. And the whole valley used to be filled with buildings that have fallen down in subsequent earthquakes. But if you walk across the valley, you're stepping over house foundations everywhere you turn. And then the rocks, the cliffs are filled with staircases, water channels. You cannot go a meter without finding something the Nabataeans have built or made. It's an absolutely fantastic site. And so it's best known for its monumental rock-cut facade tombs. Here's the obelisk tomb, and then the Kazna monument, which is probably the most famous. You may have seen it in some popular movies, showed up in Transformers. I'm a very big Star Wars fan, so this is not actually a Nabataean facade tomb, but I was very pleased. Since part of this movie was shot very close to Petra, the digital set designers decided to include a kind of space-age version of a facade tomb in the movie, which really made me happy. And so as you can see, there's been a lot of cultural influence, but not many people know of the site of Petra, kind of in the same way that Rakhmu, as it was known to the Nabataeans, kind of in the same way that the city had a very large influential role in the Mediterranean world, especially around the 1st century AD, but has kind of disappeared from public view in ways that other ancient cities haven't. So anyway, to talk about, I worked on 2 projects while I was there, the Wadi Mataha project and the Adair Plateau project. I'm going to go very quickly through both of them just to give you an idea of what we worked on. In the Wadi Mataha project, which was in a valley called Wadi Mataha, we worked in 2 monumental tombs. You can see here on the right side is site 15, very large tomb, and also site 20. These were carved out of the cliff. And then to give you an idea, here's inside of the tomb. You can see they've weathered over the years quite a bit, but they used to be plastered and painted. They were very nice. And then they had kind of these stalls where inside of the stall, there would be a loculus, like hole cut into the floor where people would be buried. I'm there on the right, making a little test dig in one of the loculi that we were going to excavate that season. And then also that big hole in the ceiling is from an earthquake around 300 AD. There are quite a few earthquakes that this region experiences. So part of the tomb ceiling fell in. And then here are the remains of a Nabataean person, a man in his 30s that we excavated from one of the loculi. And then we would often try to reconstruct the bones that we found to get an idea of the person's age, perhaps their cause of death, what sort of health conditions they had. Here we were very pleased to find all parts of the spine of a person because, for reasons I'm going to tell you just now, or from now, there are different types of burial at Petra. So, and then just here really quick is a view of site 15. You can see my colleague Jake there in the doorway, just gives you an idea of the scale of the tombs, just how large they are. So anyway, within these cists, there are 2 types of main burial that we come across. We have primary burial, where someone is just placed in the cyst as they die. And then there's secondary burial, where generally a person passes away and their body is placed out in the open to be exposed to the elements for several months. The flesh decays, and then eventually loved ones go back, gather up the bones, and place them in the cyst graves. And we'll find a lot of indicators of that. We'll see weathering on the bones. In one case, we found a skull that had a lot of finger bones pushed inside because someone had used the skull as a handy carrying basket. So that shows you that someone has handled those bones after they were defleshed. But of course, there's also quite a lot of grave looting that happened in Petra in present day. From the Roman period onward, the Crusaders did a lot of looting because the Nabataeans were very wealthy, often put gold in their graves. And so you have to be careful as you sort through these indicators. And we also see modification of bones. So my main question that I wanted to explore while I was there was why would people choose these 2 types of burial? What factors would cause you to be either buried primarily, just placed in the cyst, or to receive secondary burial, to be exposed? So first I thought maybe there's some sort of difference between age or sex. That did not appear to be the case at all. Looking at, this is just for one tomb, but looking at tombs across Petra, we would find individuals of all ages and of both sexes buried in secondary and primary contexts. I then looked at ethnic groups. Here are some wealthy but not royal tombs in Wadi Farasa. And generally poorer people were buried just in plain cysts, these rectangular loculi just out on the bare stone. But we would find primary and secondary burial in those contexts too, both in wealthy and poor. Family groupings was generally how these tombs were arranged. And even for lower class people, they would be family groupings of cysts. And that didn't appear to affect whether you would receive primary or secondary burial. We'd find instances of both kinds of burial in the same tomb. So looking then at the Nabataeans had several cities outside of Petra, of course, although Petra remained their kind of spiritual and cultural core. And I found that there's almost no secondary burial in these places outside of Petra. Very few people had written on this. A couple people had suggested that perhaps secondary burial was simply traders who died while out trading in the trade routes and their bones would be carried back. That doesn't make sense why we would find so many bones of children and infants in secondary contexts, because presumably they're not trading. So as far as I can tell, especially during the 1st century AD, as the Nabataean kingdom expanded and there would be all these satellite cities. Here is a very famous one, Madan Saleh, which is in Saudi Arabia. Nabataeans would build facade tombs of the same kind that they'd built in Petra. But if you're buried in these sites, you only find primary burial. You almost never see secondary burial. But it seems many people still had a very strong spiritual connection or family connection to the site of Petra as being kind of the center of Nabataean culture. So many people would have their bones desiccated and then carried back to be buried in the family crypt alongside the bones of their family members or ancestors, because travel was very easy for the Nabataeans across these stretches of impassable desert. So as far as I can tell, this is my theory that it seems to be the reason for why we see so much primary and secondary burial alongside each other. Now, moving on to something completely different, I was very lucky to work in another project, the Adair Plateau project, which examines water in Petra. Here's a barrel-vaulted cistern that's still used. And then there we are, we're excavating a very large cistern to the side of the Adair monument, which is this very large, very famous monument right here. As you can see, Petra is very dry. It's quite a harsh desert, but they're about a month and a half a year. So in November and December, they'll receive torrential rains. And the Nabataeans were geniuses with water systems. They had canals on rocks everywhere you look in order to make use of the most amount of water that fell on this landscape. And then for the rest of the 10 months of the year, they would be able to keep a city of 20 to 25,000 people hydrated just with the water that they kept in these cisterns. And a very interesting thing is that these cisterns and water canals are still in use today by the Bedouin tribes living in the area, the Badul who live right in Petra, the Amarim who live a little further south in Little Petra is what the site is called in Beda, and then the Layantha who live in Wadi Musa. And there's actually quite a bit of conflict between the Bedouin tribes who have lived for a very long time in these archaeological sites, and then the Jordanian government and the Department of Antiquities, who from the 80s, when Petra was made a national park, have tried to restrict access of water to these people who've historically lived here for a long time. So on the Adair Plateau, as you can see, there's a very large circle, a circular pool that we're excavating here that was recently discovered. And we kind of have three goals in excavating this area. First, we want to learn more about the past, about the technologies that the people of Petra had in moving and storing water, because they were quite ingenious. We also want to protect the monument, so preserve the future. As you can see, the front of the monument is scored up 3 meters. It has this deep carving through it. That's scoring from flooding, because when the plateau floods in the winter, the water will swirl around the front of the monument and will just cut up the face of that sandstone. And so we've done quite a bit of work to try to protect the monument. And we also want to help the present, because the Badul tribes people who live in this area still use these water systems, and water rights are a very important and very controversial topic. And I tend to fall more on the side of defending the rights of the people who are still living in this area to be able to use the water that falls in this area. But we want to do what we can to help the area be as sustainable as possible. So we want to learn more about the past, to preserve this site for future generations, and to help the people who are living here now, which I feel is very important as we go into a discussion of how archaeologists or archaeology research can tangibly, materially help people who are living today as we look at issues relating to natural disasters or to climate. And also it's very relevant in terms of increasing social inequality and examining, uncovering, and dismantling these unequal structures. And so just a question that I wanted to pose to everyone as I finish up is to think about, since I'm in California, and probably many of you are in California as well, or maybe in different areas of the world, to think about the sorts of landscape issues or climate issues that you face. Does Sarah have a question?
Yeah, so no, I don't mean to cut you off. You can go ahead and finish.
Okay.
I would like to invite the listeners to ask questions in the chat box. Yeah, I was just going to comment that it just sounds like we have a lot we could learn from the Nabataeans about managing our own water.
Exactly.
They were so good at that. Just a question about the last slide when you talked about the massive, floods coming through. This is quite soft rock, right?
Yes.
It's amazing to me that it hasn't eroded it more over thousands of years.
It's eroded quite a bit already. So in the site of Petra, there are different layers of sandstone of different hardnesses. And there's one layer in particular, marine. I don't remember the Arabic name for the layer of sandstone, but where a lot of the tombs were carved because it was softer and easier to work with. They're carving with copper chisels, mind. And they also carve from the top down to the bottom. And so while many of the tombs have been very eroded when they're in exposed places. And so there was actually quite a bit of work that Brigham Young University, the university that I was working on this project together with, in 2012, they brought in a lot of geologists who had belaying experience, and they actually belayed down the front of the Adair monument and cleaned out all of these channels because the Nabataeans carved channels within the monument to direct the water to keep it from tearing up the face of the monument. But over the last 2,000 years, they filled in or broken off. And so in clearing out these old water canals and channels, we're actually helping the site to function as it once did.
Is there concern about, that you showed that slide with that crazy hole in the ceiling where the earthquake had some collapse. Is there concern doing archaeology there about the stability of these monuments or these structures?
Earthquakes aren't incredibly common. They happen once every, large ones happen once every few hundred years. In general, the area is fairly stable. We didn't worry about it too much. We just knew of historical events that had caused particular types of damage. There are, especially from the Roman period onward, there are quite a few records of this, although the Nabataeans also had their own writing system and would keep records of this sort of thing as well, just not as detailed as the Romans.
Well, and these aren't very deep structures, right? That's what surprised me, I think, having seen Indiana Jones and then going to that and going inside it and realizing it didn't go all the way in and there wasn't a crusader knight sitting in the deep depths of it, waiting with a chalice and all that. So, they give the impression that it's this big, deep building, but are most of them just these sort of shallow structures?
Most of them are fairly plain, empty rooms on the inside. They would have once been plastered and decorated, and there are very few places where we can see traces of the beautiful plasterwork and molding that would have once been there. So they would have been quite decorated and much richer and more comfortable inside. Although some of the nicest, these are all tombs. The tombs were the ones carved into the rock. And you also have to realize that these were blank cliffs without natural caves in them. And people just came and carved in everything. Everything that was hollowed out by human hands. But most of the spaces where people lived, where they could really make them very rich and nice, were generally brick and mortar buildings that for the most part have fallen down.
Okay. And these were plastered on the outside too?
Yes.
Wow. And were they painted too?
As far as we know.
That must have been amazing. We have several questions coming in from the audience. So one listener is asking, how did the Nabataean economy support building these tombs? Was there substantial inequality to make burial like this possible for a select few? Or was the society just remarkably wealthy in general?
A little bit of both, as far as I know. There's still a lot that's not known about Nabataean society. A lot of what we know is from other records of other people who interacted with them. But it seems in general, people who lived in Petra were fairly wealthy, although there was definite wealth and class inequality. But there are quite a few of these tombs. This one you're looking at here was, as far as we know, a royal tomb, but there are quite a few tombs on this scale, and then smaller tombs of the sort that you saw in Wadi Mataha that we were excavating in, and then even smaller, plainer tombs, and then the cist graves. So there was definitely a class structure. But in general, it seems that most people who lived in Petra specifically, and then in the Nabataean satellite cities, were fairly wealthy, had a fairly wealthy life. Nabataean society thrived through trade. They weren't able to produce too much in the desert, although they did have terrace farming and they would produce some of their own food. But for the most part, they received trade. They received most of their goods through trade. But in general, just looking at the amounts of wealth that people were able to accumulate, the Nabataeans are kind of liked but disliked by other people in the Mediterranean because of how wealthy they were and how kind of jealously they guarded the trade routes. And so some people kind of saw them as a bit parasitic, sitting on the trade routes and making it harder. But the Nabataeans had knowledge of traveling through the desert that no one else had. And so they were really able to kind of have a monopoly on that part of the Arabian Peninsula.
That's interesting. Are you, so in looking at these secondary burials, is there some kind of chemical analysis, like isotopes or something, that you could use to see if some of these individuals are coming from farther away, or that their bones are being brought from farther away?
It's difficult to do that just because of the nature of what happens to bones when they're exposed and weathered. It's also very expensive. For the most part, that wasn't, we didn't do that too much, at least with our project. I know some of it has been done, but for the most part, analysis of how many people were foreigners to Petra who happened to die there and be buried there was done through analysis of burial type. For instance, if you found cremations, which are quite rare, that would indicate that person was a foreigner. This isn't a topic I know so much about, but in general, just because of how many of these graves have been robbed and how many of the skeletal remains have been disturbed, there's already doing types of analysis, like chemical analysis, DNA analysis, isotope analysis, to look at the general health of the people or what sort of diet they're eating is difficult to do in these contexts.
Okay. Could you go back? You had a slide that showed a secondary burial that had a whole bunch of people in it.
Yes, this one.
A whole bunch of bones.
Yes.
So if you could just explain, like, how does one go about excavating that?
Very carefully. So it's the strangest thing. So within this particular tomb itself, I think, so this loculus is this one right here is E. No, it's A. Sorry, it's this one right here. But within this tomb, we had several that had one primary burial. We had several that had two primary burials where they would put someone in the cist, put on cover stones, put another person on. But this had at least 6 adults. And I think in this tomb, one cist was found to have remains of up to a minimum number of at least 12 adults. And so the burial types really varied, but it seems that for some time, a cist would be left open and new bones would be added. We'd also find, as far as we can tell, votive funerary offerings where people would come to the open cist and would leave something, would toss something inside as probably an offering to the dead ancestors. There's some research connecting it to other types of Greek burial where you would kind of mingle the bones of people who've passed away in a family crypt, and kind of as their psyche, as their spirit disappears, they get subsumed into an ancestral identity that's collective. And there might be some aspect of that going on. But excavating this is very, very difficult. You don't want to lose small bones if you can help it, but drawing layers and layers and layers as it gets more and more jumbled and more things appear is quite difficult. So we all got good at sketching on the fly.
Right, I can imagine. How many, maybe you mentioned this in your talk, but how many burials or how many individuals did you end up with in your study?
In my study, because I was using data from quite a few people. So in my study, I was looking at, it was several hundreds of tombs. And so I was looking at thousands of individuals that had been recovered. In our 2017 season, when I was there, we had 5 or 6 individuals that because we only opened 2 or so loculi.
Okay, so this is time-consuming work.
Yes, we don't want to do this too quickly. Something as complicated as this. So this was one that was excavated in 2008, long before I came to the project. I felt that the sketch was very illustrative.
Great. So a listener, just moving on to sort of a different topic, someone is asking about what's your advice for an inquisitive tourist who wants to make a visit to these sites but doesn't want to be seen as a potential shopper or souvenir hunter?
don't dig random things. As you're there, you'll probably run into, there are several archaeological projects ongoing in different parts of the site of Petra, which is a very large city. There's a lot beyond what the average tourist goes and sees, especially if they go through a guided tour. You'll be taken through the largest monuments, but there's quite a lot, especially in these wadis, these valleys that go off in different directions. And you're free to wander the park as you wish, but very few people do it. And so there's quite a lot to see that I think is very wonderful and very out of the way. One risk is to not climb onto something that you can't get down off of. That's actually the largest cause of injury and death in Petra, is people climbing onto a cliff or on top of a pinnacle that they then get afraid they can't get down from, and they fall and injure themselves. If any tourist goes missing, the local Badul people are always very, very helpful, very quickly mobilized, and they know these valleys and these cliffs better than anyone, and they're always able to quickly find the person. So don't do anything that would injure yourself, but I think it would be a good idea to kind of go off the beaten path and take a look around at some of the places that maybe tourists don't go quite as often. You can make your own itinerary as you wish. And while there, you will probably encounter different teams. There's one from Brown University that has ongoing excavations. There's a French team that was there. There's often a Japanese team. As people are working, feel free to stop by and ask them what they're doing. Our work on the Great Circle, the pool in front of the Adair Monument, there were tourists filing past all day because many people come up to see the monument, and they would often stop and ask us what we were doing. And we actually really enjoyed those moments to be able to talk with people from all over the world. So don't feel that you're disturbing people who are there working.
So you can really still just, things aren't roped off. I mean, I was there really maybe 20 years ago and you could climb over everything, but that sounds like it's still that's the case still?
Entering inside, so right now, no one's able to enter inside the Kazna Monument and the Adair Monument. There are just some bricks, like a little row of bricks over the front of the doorway. So going inside some of the largest monuments, you can kind of peer inside and you'll see it's a big empty stone room. Other than that, I can't remember any restrictions on where you can or can't go.
Wow.
Just be respectful. Be as respectful to the local culture as you can. Many people come dressed inappropriately for the desert. And also, since this is a Muslim country, many people wearing next to nothing. That's just a bad idea. Don't do that if you can avoid it. Be as respectful and kind to people as you see. And read up a little bit on it before you go. And people are very pleased to tell you about the history of the area.
Great. Well, so we have more comments from the questions from the audience that I'd like to get to. Yes. Someone has asked about if you can comment on trade goods from the classical world that complement the architectural styles that we can see that clearly have Hellenic influence.
Oh, absolutely. So the Nabataean kingdom was a very cosmopolitan place, and people did come from all over the world, and you can see those artistic influences. So here in this area, in these tombs, you can see kind of the staircase motif at the top of some of them. We call that crow stepping, and that's a very Nabataean motif. But inside some of these other tombs, you can see kind of these Greek style triangular, I do not recall the word off the top of my head. I even had Greek class, but that kind of doorway. And then, but these very square pillars. In some cases, you see round, more classical style pillars. So there's a mix of different types of influences. That's also reflected in the Nabataean religious beliefs. Dushara was one of the main Nabataean gods, but they worshipped Greek, Egyptian, Anatolian, Syrian gods and goddesses, which kind of reflects where all of these cultural influences were coming from. And you can see those same influences in a lot of the architecture. Let me just get a good and illustrative picture. Yes, you can see here just kind of a mix of architectural styles. And there's been quite a lot of work done on that.
Great. Someone is asking about if we know anything about how the Nabataeans dealt with sewage or avoided contamination of the stored water during the 10 months when they didn't have any rain.
That's a great idea, or that's a great question. As far just from the sheer number of canals, it seems that they had certain canals or what's the word? Little channels kind of dedicated for different purposes. But looking at issues with the cisterns now, one of the cistern pictures I have, you can actually see there's a piece of trash. There's like a plastic bottle and some other things floating in it. And that makes the water difficult to use. And I honestly don't know how people dealt with disease. Looking at some of the isotope analysis of Nabataean bones that have been recovered, we see that in general, the Nabataeans were relatively healthy, although they experienced high incidence of fractures from non-fatal falls. As you can see, there's cliffs all over the place. But there's also records from the Roman period and even before of plagues and diseases that would occasionally sweep the city. So it seems that issues with the water supply did crop up, but that's not something I know that much about, sadly.
Well, so someone else is asking about the sort of furniture and the finds that were in these settings. Like, where do the finds end up? Where can we go to see what was actually inside these tombs?
So if you go to Petra, and then also in other places of Jordan, but in Wadi Musa, which is one of the cities next to the site of Petra, where you can actually enter the site going through the Baba Sik, the very famous narrow chasm, the canyon that leads into the Khazna, as seen from Indiana Jones, very dramatic. At the beginning of that canyon, there is a museum right there in Wadi Musa, and that's probably one of the best places, especially to see the few examples of certain kinds of finds that aren't so well preserved. We don't get a lot of wooden artifacts or plaster, but the ones that are found are in this museum and are preserved there. So you can get a good picture of Nabataean life and daily life and the sorts of furnishings they'd have before you go in and see the tombs.
That's great. I'm sure lots of our listeners would like to go visit there at some point. It's so beautiful. We are about to wrap up, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to bridge your work in Japan with this work that you did in Jordan. If you would like to just comment for a minute or two about sort of the similarities that you see in the landscapes and challenges faced by people in ancient Jordan and ancient Japan.
Yes, even at the time that I was working in Jordan, I knew that I was planning to do graduate work in Japan, and I'd been studying Japanese for a very long time. I look at a time period in Japan that also had very large monumental tomb structures. Japan, of course, is a very different climate. Water is plentiful. We get human bones are rarely preserved. The soil chemistry is completely different. It's as far from a desert as you could imagine. But still, I see many of the issues relating to water systems and control and flow of water apply in both Japan and Jordan. Both regions experience earthquakes and other types of natural disasters that it's always very interesting to see the sorts of solutions that people in the past would face, would create to deal with these environmental issues that were just inherent to the landscape they were in. And I think there's an awful lot that we as archaeologists can, as we make our findings public, that people in general can learn about how people in the past dealt with these climate issues or these natural disasters that still occur today. And they can kind of give us an innovative look into ways we could more sustainably deal with the same sorts of disasters we face today. The climate of Jordan in the past is very similar to what it is today. There was a thought that some people used to believe that perhaps Jordan had once been much more fertile during the Mediterranean, during the Hellenistic period. That doesn't seem to be the case. So it was really people's innovation and genius that allowed them to thrive so well in that climate. And I think taking that sort of perspective to different parts of the world and then seeing what sort of information would be valuable for you as a member of your community trying to live more sustainably and solve problems is just a very good mindset to take.
Great. Thank you so much for that perspective. And thank you for joining us today to talk about your fascinating work. And I'd like to also thank the listeners for joining us today and for submitting some very thought-provoking questions.
Thank you.
So I hope you can join us again. We're going to actually have a Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday next week. We're having 3 Ask an Archaeologist episodes. Monday is rescheduled. Dr. Rita Lucarelli, who is going to be presenting a talk called From the Museum Back to the Tomb, the virtual rejoining of a sarcophagus and its burial in 26th Dynasty Saqqara. So we hope you can join us on Monday. And we'll be sending out an announcement about the upcoming shows for next week as well. So please also feel free to follow the link at the bottom of the description of this talk to give us feedback about the series on the feedback form. So thanks so much, Anna, for joining us.